Hello and welcome to the Project Hope podcast for families and friends with a loved one in a group of high demand, high control. I am your host, Jennifer. A lot has changed since I first started this podcast, so I thought I'd add a little to the initial introductions and provide something that's more up to date. I work with survivors of coercive control one-to-one. I also consult with families, and I offer education to the public around such topics. For the full scope of what I offer and also my credentials, you're welcome to check out my website, jennifer-french.com. I have a master's in the psychology of coercive control, and as of August 2024, I've been accepted into a PhD program called Psychology, Policy, and Law, and I'll have a specialty in either criminal behavior or forensic victimology. This will support the work that I currently do as an expert witness in cases involving coercive control. The Project Hope podcast has provided such an amazing opportunity for me to meet many wonderful people, survivors, experts, family members, and it's truly a pleasure to meet each one of these individuals you will hear from. This podcast will conclude with season 2 as I enter into my PhD program, but I have many other exciting things on the horizon, so please stay in touch and go to my website for any and all current events. Thanks to all of you who listen to Project Hope and care about this community. Sometimes it's so strange how paths in life seem to cross. When I first met Joel Pitney, sometime between 2005 to 2010, I believe, in my own cultish group, I was living in Oakland, California, and helping to run that center, having taken vows into the priesthood. At the time, we were at a growth peak, and our leaders, Peter and Claire, had casually manipulated us into a hearty push for recruitment. They began encouraging us to attend other spiritual events and spiritual lectures by other teachers while explicitly telling us that we don't, quote unquote, fish in other people's ponds. However, if people had questions for us ministers, and we did blatantly stand out wearing all black with clerical collars and crosses on, so if people did have questions for us that we were to carry our marketing materials and perhaps even some of the books our teachers had written, with no intention, of course, to draw people into our group. I'm being sarcastic, of course. So in this spirit, we went to a lecture from one of the teachers we were hearing a lot about. And he had been described to us as an American guru with some sort of Eastern training, and his organization, EnlightenNext, was gaining worldwide traction with centers in the UK, Holland, Sweden, France, Australia, Israel, and India, as well as his large residential compound in Western Mass called Fox Hollow. You'll hear Joel refer to this. The group also published the EnlightenNext magazine, which actually was a widely read publication in its genre, selling in major retail stores in the US and featuring interviews with cultural creatives and thought leaders like Deepak Chopra and Tony Robbins. So my experience of Andrew in this intimate setting that we attended, a lecture that he was giving, was that he felt totally familiar to me. His style and energy felt similar to my male teacher, Father Peter, as I called him at the time. He was directive, prescriptive, unexpected, and challenging. So both these teachers seemed to call people to their highest selves without any excuses, was kind of the flavor. And so began what I would call a kindred and sincere connection between students with different gurus. There was a group of about 6 core followers of Andrew's who we fell into communication and connection with, and Joel and his now ex-wife were a part of this crew. We had them over for dinner. They attended a few of our Introduction to Christian Mysticism classes, and we actually went out and socialized at a restaurant, I recall. So a number of months ago, when the name Andrew Cohen came up during a lecture I was attending in my master's program for the psychology of coercive control, you can imagine it was a jolt from the past. I knew that Joel and I were Facebook friends and that he had remarried and had a gorgeous little boy. It occurred to me that he seemed to no longer be with Andrew Cohen, so I looked it all up. I was shocked to find that Andrew seemed to have disappeared in 2013, along with EnlightenNext, and the story of how and why this happened over the internet seemed very vague. So I reached out to Joel, and the rest feels like a history that's just beginning. I am extremely grateful to have reconnected with Joel. I'm sure you will find this interview very interesting. It covers so much about the complexity of leaders and the group dynamics that they create. So on that note, please enjoy. All right. Welcome, Joel Pitney. Thank you so much for joining me on the Project Hope podcast. I am super psyched to have you here today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So as our listeners know a little bit about your background, that you had years with Andrew Cohen of EnlightenNext. And I wanted to just begin, Joel, by asking if you would just share with us a little bit about kind of your involvement, how long you were with Andrew, and also a little bit about that mission and kind of the flavor of him as a teacher, leader, and what was sort of going on in the community, the general flavor of it.
Okay. Great. Yeah. So I was involved with Andrew Cohen and the community was called EnlightenNext. I guess it was an organization called EnlightenNext. I was involved for 10 years, approximately, at varying levels. And that spanned, from originally reading a book of his and being a subscriber to a magazine that EnlightenNext published. It was called What Is Enlightenment at the time, to eventually becoming, kind of a lower level student of his teachings, where I was a virtual student, so I lived on my own, in another corner of the country and studied the teachings and did conference calls with people. And eventually I got more and more involved, and I became more of a core student of, I guess you would call our little sangha, or ashram or monastery, or however you want to define it. And I eventually wrote for the magazine, What Is Enlightenment magazine, which eventually became EnlightenNext magazine for the last couple of years.
Yes.
Yeah. And I kind of span that, and that sort of and my involvement in the community were for the last roughly 10 years of the community's existence. I left when the community ended, back in 2013.
And how long was it kind of going on for prior to your involvement?
I used to know this better. It's been a while since I thought about this, but I think Andrew started teaching in 1986, I think. And in the beginning, it was just sort of, he was in India along with a lot of other seekers up in the Himalayas, and had an awakening experience, and then started teaching, and people started flocking to him, as goes in some of these stories. And a community started to build up around him that grew and grew, and eventually moved to Europe, and then eventually moved to the United States. In the East Coast, then went to the West Coast, then back to the East Coast, and it just grew and grew and grew over time.
And so part of the reason why I ask you that is just in terms of timing and sort of the unfoldment of these leaders that tend to hold a real power and sort of force around them and then build a community. I'm always curious kind of the trajectory of the timeline and possibly when that power starts to become something that's possibly unhealthy for the people that are around,
Right.
or and so I was just trying to put a little bit of timing around where you were at in that kind of evolution.
Right.
And I guess this is an outstanding question that, as you know, part of the reason why Andrew Cohen even came up for me was because in this master's course that I'm taking on psychology of coercive control, his
Yeah.
name came up, and I remembered that it rang a bell, and I couldn't remember from where. And then, of course, when I looked him up, I realized there was this whole connection and association and affiliation with you and some others from this group. And so I've also kind of wondered, it was the first time that I had heard that the community fell apart. And I wondered, of course, why, because it's always fascinating when you have these leaders.
Right.
When things fall apart, there tends to be a reason for that. And there tends to be an unhealthy reason under it.
Right.
And so I then got online, as you know, and tried to kind of figure out what had happened. And it's actually quite difficult to figure out what happened to Andrew Cohen and EnlightenNext.
Right. Yeah,
So,
no, I mean, there's not a lot out there. I mean, I guess there's been some small little documentaries done. There's been some books written, but nothing recent. I think a lot of people sort of moved on and didn't really want to talk about it that much.
yeah. Yeah. And so also what was fascinating to me when you and I spoke previously was that you had mentioned that you had actually read a couple of those books before getting heavily involved in the community.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you would speak a little bit to that, because once again, in terms of people's perception of these sorts of environments, they assume that people kind of go in blind, which is typically the case. But
Mm-hmm.
actually, you had read some books that people who had left had written. Is that correct?
I would say kind of. I can't remember if I read the books or if I read the book or if I read the blog that the books sort of sprung out of.
Okay.
But I was fully aware of a lot of the things that went on. I mean, there was, and I think this started with a question about, at what point did things start to kind of go sour, or did cultic dynamics start to emerge? And, I didn't get involved until 2003, 2004. So it's hard for me to know exactly, but I know that looking back and talking to other people and also researching a little bit myself, I think there were a lot of these things kind of starting from the very beginning. I think that kind of happens in these kind of communities. I think when you're trying to create a countercultural spiritual community that has a leader, especially in a Western context, it's going to have cultic dynamics baked into it. It's just going to, I think.
Yeah.
I don't think that you can avoid that. And I think there's a certain inevitability to that you have to fight against. And so I think a lot of that stuff was going on from the very beginning. And there were some disaffected students who left at different times, people who had been very high up, people who had been kind of like Andrew's, right-hand man or woman,
Yeah.
who left and were very upset, and there had been trauma, and there's a lot of definitions of what that trauma is.
Sure.
We're not talking about physical abuse or sexual abuse of any kind. More psychological, spiritual trauma. And they started a blog called What Enlightenment? So, because the magazine was called What Is Enlightenment? And so they had a blog called What Enlightenment? And it was a place for people who were former students of Andrew Cohen to get together and expose what was really going on to people, because Andrew and EnlightenNext and What is Enlightenment got pretty big at one point, started to diverge into mainstream circles. A lot of people who know about post-traditional spirituality had heard of Andrew. He would do dialogues in public dialogues with Deepak Chopra. The magazine was on Whole Foods bookshelves and Barnes and Noble bookshelves. So the people wanted to kind of to share the dark underbelly of the community with this blog. And so when I was getting involved, and very reluctantly, I had no interest in anything like this, and the whole thing kind of seemed culty to me. I kind of had these two things. I was being very pulled because I was deeply moved by it from a spiritual and a philosophical level, and something was calling me, and something was happening to me that I couldn't help.
Yes.
And at the same time, I was like, red flags, red flags. All these people are saying stuff. This is crazy. This is, it seemed like a cult. I mean, I had met lots of people who were involved, and they seemed super culty to me. Hi, how are you? Would you like to sign up?
Big hugs,
and
a little love bombing.
All kinds of weird stuff, and everything was just a little bit, there were some people that were super cool. You could tell everybody was very intelligent and, had a certain kind of transmission, but the way people would talk and they look at me and everyone was so clear and sure about themselves. It seemed very kind of culty to me. So I was digging around too, I wanted to find out, and the way I saw it at the time was through the lens of the teaching. And, the teaching is that like any enlightenment or mystical teaching from any school, it's very, Andrew's teachings they're deeply rooted in Hindu Advaita traditions, but then they ended up becoming influenced by others. But I would say it's probably like an Advaita foundation with a lot of little things kind of put on top of it.
Yeah.
And people were we were trying to transcend ego, right? Yeah. Transcending ego, and transcending ego has always been a very difficult task. In any tradition, if you look at the mystical schools of any tradition, the kind of asceticism that monks have to do, the kind of renunciation that people have to do, the kind of things that you have to do to evolve beyond your animal nature and your just fundamentally self-centered animal instincts,
right.
Requires a lot of extreme stuff. And so when I heard people talking about the extreme things that had happened to them, I was like, well, yeah, that sounds like you were trying to go beyond ego, and it's a big deal. And if you go read you can read all kinds of stories from India that no one ever freaks out about,
right.
Where people did all kinds of crazy stuff like that. And so I just figured, well, okay, that's kind of what this is. And if you don't succeed in what you're trying to do, then you're probably going to end up having this reaction, because then you'll retroactively look back at all the extreme things you did and say, oh, I was being manipulated. Oh, I was being forced. But at the end of the day, you're forgetting that you chose this path of enlightenment.
Yes.
And I felt, it's funny. When I speak about it, I kind of feel like, hey, that's kind of how I feel today. I think I do a little bit, I think me personally, I don't feel like anyone, I was manipulated.
Yeah.
But no more than anyone gets manipulated in any, hierarchical structure in culture. I mean, it was just that the stakes were very high.
Yes. Yeah. And that is the interesting sort of general principle that I think makes some of these conversations so difficult. That people really, we really are being influenced all the time by many different things, whether it's people, messages, billboards, what have you. And this is simply another form. And then there, can obviously be serious detriment. And again, this is why we talk about it within sort of the cult world. It's like there's a spectrum, there's a continuum of bad to good and a lot of gray in between.
Right. Yeah. Right. And there's some. Hello?
Oh, got you.
Oh, we just froze. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. And I think that's what makes it interesting.
Yes. Yeah. So you ended up getting, once you moved, you ended up getting very involved, and you were very kind of close to Andrew and working closely with him. And now, was your job, life world, with EnlightenNext?
Yeah, everything. And that was a big moment for me kind of along the way, is that as I was getting more deeply involved, when I first got involved, I was an organic farmer. That was my ex-wife and I were on track we were living on organic farms. I studied environmental science in college. Our dream was to eventually have our own organic farm where that's what we'd be doing. We had a very utopian vision for our lives in that way. And we, as we got more deeply involved, a couple things started to happen. We got more interested in what the community was doing and wanting to make an impact on the world at that level. I think, and then also personally, I started to realize, well, maybe organic farming isn't the best use of my talents.
Yeah.
Because I thought that, and I don't know if this is necessarily true now, but I went to college. I was a pretty highly cognitive person.
Yes.
I was a good writer, a good thinker, and I felt like a lot of that was being wasted when I was out there just picking cucumbers all day.
Yeah.
Even though the reason I wanted to get into organic farming was very idealistic in the food system and creating, living in harmony with nature and all the engineering aspects of all that. But
yes, it's
99% of your day is just like, driving a tractor. Yeah, exactly. So I started to kind of think, okay, maybe there's another way that I could, even though I really loved it, I maybe there's something more I could be doing with what's been invested in me. That's kind of how I thought about it. My parents and the government helped me go to college.
Right.
I got a degree. Maybe I should be doing something more with that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I was getting really involved with the philosophy of the magazine and in EnlightenNext. And so I eventually started a business with some other students. Okay. My wife and some other students. We started a thought leadership platform development business.
Yeah.
It was kind of a tech startup. It was we were trying to develop a platform that thought leaders could use to build their brands. And then right as that business was starting to kind of turn a little bit in the positive direction, I got an offer to work for the magazine, which was my dream job. When that happened, I couldn't even believe it. It's like it felt like I got drafted into the NBA or something.
Yeah.
Because I was obsessed with the magazine. I'd get the magazine in my mailbox and I'd read, and we were talking like these are 100-page thick, long form journalism magazines. Yeah. I'd read the whole thing in a day, front to back. And I'd listen to all the podcasts and interviews associated with it. I was obsessed. So when I got the opportunity to work for them, I was like, oh my God. So, and that's what really facilitated me moving there.
Okay.
And then I was in the deep end. Then it was all in. It was like, all right, I'm living here. This is my spiritual life. I've got my spiritual community. My job is writing for this magazine.
Yeah.
I was all in.
And your ex-wife had moved with you.
Mm-hmm.
And so at this point now, what does your living arrangement look like? Were people living in the community at all?
Yeah. So Fox Hollow is a,
yes.
It's I guess you could call it a compound. It was a retreat center, residential retreat center in Western Massachusetts in the Berkshires. Yeah. And that was the world headquarters for EnlightenNext. Right. There were centers around the world. We had centers that had public gathering spaces and also residential areas in London, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, New York City, Boston. We had centers all around, but this was the mothership.
Yes, because I knew about, is it Fox Hollow?
Fox Hollow, yeah.
Yes, I had known about that. I didn't realize actually the international scope of things.
Yeah.
But I'm not surprised because also the magazine was really big. I remember seeing that magazine.
Right. And so that's at the headquarters. So we were on this beautiful property up on a ridge in the Berkshire Mountains in Western Massachusetts. And the property originally was owned by the Westinghouse family. No, it was the Vanderbilts. Okay. Then the Westinghouses. Yeah. And then it was a girls' school. Oh. And then it was Kripalu. Kripalu was originally there. Amrit Desai.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. another community, right? And
Yeah.
then we bought it at some point, and I say we, the community bought it from Kripalu, and Kripalu moved basically across the valley.
Yeah.
And
Huh.
so so we had this huge old manor house, which I think it was a place, the Tanglewood, I think the original Tanglewood Orchestra festivals might have originally played in this building. I could be wrong on that, but I know that they used to have some serious concerts there way back in the day in
Yeah.
this area called it was this big grand old building.
I bet we'll get some comments in this interview like, I remember that location. I did this there.
Yeah, exactly. And then we had a retreat center there. So we had, this big manor house, and all our offices were there. So we ran the magazine, and then we had a whole education and retreat department. And so there were, quite a few people employed. We were a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And then we had a series of sort of living quarters all around the property as well. Some of them were like dorms, like dorm style living. That's mostly where I lived, in these kind of dorms. Others were a little bit more like condos. And then Andrew lived in an apartment. He actually he lived in an apartment in the house. And then he had a big kind of office.
Yeah.
So there were, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 buildings sprinkled throughout the property.
And then were you and your wife in a room alone, or were you?
Yes. Yeah. And we always lived together. A lot of people would get split up.
Yeah.
But we always lived together until we actually separated. So, yeah. And we were basically in a dorm room.
Yeah.
In a building that had, I think, 13 or 14 rooms. It was called Fullness. All the buildings we had names like emptiness, fullness, humility, freedom.
Yeah.
And we lived in Fullness, and that was kind of like the junior dorm. So the younger students lived there, because I think I moved there when I was 26, 27 years old.
Yeah.
And yeah, we had a room, we had our own bathroom.
Yeah.
But otherwise it was just like a little dorm room, and we had a shared kitchen. And
Neat.
at that time we were eating all our meals at the manor house because we had a big commercial kitchen there for retreats.
Yeah.
But over time that changed.
I was going to say, so how did you feel about the communal aspect? I mean, having come from kind of I know a lot of the communities or people that I've known who have really been into kind of the environmental aspect of things have also appreciated communal living. So I wondered if that was a big transition for the two of you, or.
Well, it was and it wasn't, right? I mean, because it was like no other community I'd ever been in. I mean, I'd always wanted to live in a community. I mean, I still do. I just live in a house with my current wife, who also I met in the community, and our son. And I always wish all my friends would buy all the houses on the block so we could all live kind of semi-communally, but with no structure and no enforcement,
Yes.
I've always wanted to live that way. I was raised that way. My dad always had a dream to live that way, to have this kind of like dynamic between individuality but collective, because this is a time in American history when a lot of people are starting to experience the negative aspects of alienation and hyper individualism, and people are yearning for a sense of community but don't know how to do it, and our lives are kind of set up that way. And so that I've always been a bit of a counterculturalist in that way, and wanting to like, hey, let's try a new way of living. Let's live together. And so I did enjoy that. I mean, because you just have this tremendous camaraderie. But the flip side of that is that you are always being watched.
Yes.
And I say that lightly because that implies something a little bit heavy and dark and sinister, which I don't mean by that. I don't mean, we didn't have a Gestapo that was like watching our every move. It was just that when you're living super close to everyone, everyone's always noticing everything about you.
Yes. And also, if you are kind of expected to do any reporting on people, the other kind of negative being watched, it really tends to be done from a standpoint within these communities where you feel like you're in service to your brother or sister, that you're either sharing directly with them or with the higher ups, that they're off in some way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we were just up in each other's business all the time. I mean, you can't, there's nowhere to hide, so to speak. But, often the way that we would see it is there's nowhere for the ego to hide.
Right. And that's why you're there.
Exactly. And we had a principle, we called it negative freedom. Like, people love negative freedom. Like, I want to just hang out in my room by myself and watch Netflix and have ice cream, or, I want to go do this thing on my own. Right. And people will talk about that as freedom, but freedom for what? Is it freedom for the ego? Is it freedom for your higher self? We called that the authentic self, and so the idea was that if our job was, if we're all living on top of each other, we're all holding each other, holding each other to a higher standard of being, and that there's no not giving each other the space to sort of fall back into egoic patterns. And so it wasn't like a hardcore, I mean, there were some times when it would feel like that. And there were some ways in which it was systematic, but again, it was all, and I think very genuinely in spirit of higher evolution. It really was. I mean, I think that's what everybody was trying for, even Andrew,
Yeah.
But I think those structures are bound to fail.
Yeah.
And they do. I'm surprised it lasted as long as it did.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So tell me a little bit about Andrew and kind of what attracted you to him and what you kind of see as part of the whole downfall.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, it's funny, like, his personality was never something that attracted me. I remember the first thing I did is I got involved because my ex-wife's mother-in-law, my ex-wife's mother. So yeah. She would be my ex-mother-in-law.
Yes.
She introduced me to his work because she was part of the East-West movement in the 60s. She went to India and lived in an ashram in Rishikesh, which is now like a very bustling spiritual tourism epicenter. But at that time, no one was there.
Yeah.
The Beatles were across the river at the Maharishi's ashram, but it was mostly just Indians. And, she was this Western woman. And she became a disciple of a saint, really, named Swami Chidananda, who was part of the Shivananda ashram and part of the Shivananda lineage. That has had some serious giants, spiritual giants, kind of came out of that lineage. Yeah. And she was one of his students. And so she followed him for years, and he would come to America and then she would go there. My ex-wife, Christiana, was a disciple of, she also became a disciple of him.
Oh, interesting.
We went there on our honeymoon because she wanted me to meet him.
Oh, wow.
Because he was getting old. But Andrew was close to that community because Andrew had a center, the Andrew Cohen Center, had it right up the road from the Shivananda ashram in Rishikesh, in India. And there was a lot of interaction between them. They were very friendly because there was a lot of Westerners at Shivananda, and they would go, and they had a really good relationship because Andrew had a really good relationship with Swami Krishnananda and Swami Chidananda, who were kind of like spiritual brothers who ran the ashram. And so when Swami Chidananda became too old to travel to America to be able to see my ex-wife's family and many others, he recommended that they check out Andrew Cohen because he was a Western teacher who they sort of gave a stamp of approval, who was not far away, on the East Coast.
Interesting.
And so she started to go, that's how I got involved, because she introduced us to him, and she offered to pay for me and my ex-wife and her brother to go on a retreat. And they went, but I didn't, because I had an ultimate frisbee tournament and I didn't want to go to something like that. But eventually I picked up one of his books at my ex-wife's mother's house.
Yeah.
And I read it, and it really spoke to me. I was like, wow, this is incredible. And some of the stuff he was talking about in the book just really resonated with me. Like, the sense of responsibility that you have in awakening. There was a real moral context for spiritual awakening. It wasn't personal. It wasn't just, I want to have a more relaxed, I want to have more flow or peace or joy in my own personal life. It was all about, when you wake up, you realize that you're part of something much bigger, and you actually have a greater obligation, which really, resonated with my Christian roots. And so I was really into him. And then I was like, oh, okay, maybe I can kind of, I
can play in this pen.
Yeah. But the problem was, then I saw a video of him, and he was just super arrogant and off-putting, and he had this kind of cackling laugh, and I was like, I don't know. And then also my wife introduced me to some of his students that she had started to meet with,
Yeah.
and they were super culty, and I was like, so I don't know, I was kind of like, but it wasn't until we went to India that it really hit it for me.
Yeah.
Because I really gave myself to the study of Advaita Vedanta in the ashram. And then when I was going up to the Andrew Cohen Center, I was getting that as well. And it was at this time when they were really starting to talk a lot about evolutionary enlightenment, which was kind of his new modern twist on traditional Advaita enlightenment. And that was really hitting me. I was like, wow, things are just popping for me.
Yeah.
So that kind of got me sort of on the path, and it still took me a couple years to meet him. Cause again, I was like, I don't know if I want a guru, like that was not something I was into. And then I went on a retreat with him, and I had just an unbelievable experience when I talked to him the first time. It was in a retreat context, and I had this very non-dual, beyond time and space. I saw my future. I saw myself serving him for eternity.
Wow.
And so, and honestly, at that point, the deal was done. It was kind of like, all right, regardless of all the other stuff that's going to happen along the way, I'm going to have to follow this because it was so deep and so clear and so profound.
Here we go.
Yeah. And luckily there was also a very sophisticated intellectual framework around it too. So it wasn't just me letting everything down and saying, oh yes, which I think a lot of people do with these kind of things. They had this magazine where they were studying every single spiritual and personal development and psychological tradition and deconstructing everything and building a worldview around enlightenment that actually made it relevant to our current world and not in opposition to kind of the modern world, which is often how these sort of neo mystical traditions are presented. And so I was deeply satisfied at that level.
Yeah.
And
like
so
how to be of the world and not of it.
Yeah, right. How do you be the change that you wish to see in the world? How do you be in the world but not of the world? How do you reconcile your desire for individual personal spiritual transformation with your passion to change the world around you and make it a better place? And all those things were really satisfied by I guess you would call it the pedagogy of and so it, and I still think there's a lot of validity to all that, honestly.
Interesting.
So that's what compelled me.
Okay. So now you guys are on board, and so let's continue along this strain. So now you're on board, and what kind of happens as things start to crumble?
Well, yeah. So it's funny because crumble is like, things were probably starting to crumble for a long time. Just because, but probably intensified the last few years. Right. And so, and honestly, a lot of that I was not aware of because I was so new. I was joining this experiment pretty late in the game. Things had become pretty systematized. A lot of the kind of crazy wisdom stuff that used to go on in the earlier years that caused people to write these books and everything, that wasn't happening anymore because they had sort of learned, hey, maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe that's just going to cause more problems than it solves. And also what happened is you had a lot of people who, and again, how much of this is just the party line that I still kind of have versus what was objectively true. But a lot of it was that he also had a bunch of students around him who now were holding a pretty significant perspective. And so it wasn't just the way Andrew talks about it, or used to talk about it, is there was him against everyone because he was trying to get everyone to do something. And there's a whole collective dimension to this that I haven't even gotten into. But all of a sudden, some things started to flip, and now he had a lot of people kind of holding this thing. And so it was easier for people to kind of get with the program, so to speak. And the kind of ego technology, the ego transcending technology was getting a little more nuanced and softer. It was still hard. I mean, it's still just as hard as it was before. It was just nuanced. So you could it wasn't just, you're in or you're out kind of thing.
Yes.
And so that stuff just wasn't happening as much. But at the same time, so that was like the good news, right? And Andrew's star was rising, things were going really well. But at the same time, there was a lot of other things, the pathologies were starting to emerge, right? So Andrew was too involved in the business side of the organization, right? Yeah. And, like an example of this is like, he would want to have these massive celebrations. We had our own community holidays, right? Yeah. To signify different things that mark different occasions in the evolution of his teachings, yeah. Including the day he met his teacher. We called that Freedom Has No History Day, and it was it wasn't just to celebrate him, it was to celebrate when you have that awakening. Yes. And you have that break with your karma.
Yeah.
And so he wanted to have this huge celebration of the 20th or maybe 25th anniversary, I forget which one.
Yeah.
Of that day. And I was really involved in that. And everyone in the organization was against it. They were like, you are going to sink us financially if you do this. It's going to take tremendous resources to pull this big event off. It was going to be a huge in-person and virtual event. We did a 24-hour marathon where he interviewed every spiritual teacher on earth. And then we did a live broadcast of it. Oh, wow. I was involved in the production of that.
Yeah.
And we had this huge dinner where people flew in from around the world, and it was this in music, and it was this huge thing. So we would do a lot of things like that, but we were struggling as an organization because the magazine had gone under, also partially because of his mismanagement. And we were trying to figure out what to do. Right. But he forced the issue, and everyone's like, look, we get that it's important. Can we do this in a way that's not going to, hamstring us financially? And, yeah. But he always won the fights.
Yeah.
So that created a lot of frustration. So our mission was to actually have an impact on culture. It was we were trying to get some of these ideas about enlightenment, and the relevance of it, into, at least some fringes of the mainstream.
Yeah.
And yet we kept doing all this stuff that would sort of undermine those efforts. And that would be one of those things. Right. Yeah. So that was starting to happen. So that was creating a lot of and people were just starting to get sick of it. And at the same time, a lot of these sort of senior students were starting themselves to feel hamstrung.
Yes.
Because we had this very, very rigid structure that had been developed to kind of create this sort of evolutionary chamber for people where you could really evolve and take huge leaps and develop spiritually, and everything was taken care of for you. I mean, you could just totally focus on the spiritual life. It was amazing.
Right.
If you want to go for it, if you want to go for any kind of awakening or enlightenment, this is the perfect atmosphere for it, because you could just,
yeah.
But the problem was, it was, and this is my perspective. I don't know if everybody shares this. But the problem, I feel like it was a machine designed to get you to awaken.
Yes.
But then it didn't know, but there was nothing after that.
Interesting.
And so what happened was you would then be the same machine that kind of woke you up and showed you, where you had that internal awakening of, I am that, yeah. I am that in the traditional sense. I am that in the evolutionary sense, which was for us is, I am the energy and intelligence that created the universe, yeah. And you started to have this tremendous amount of spiritual agency, and creativity and and spiritual self-confidence and all these wonderful things. You would immediately run into that structure, because that structure was not meant to support that. It was supposed to break you in order for that to emerge. But then it had a hard time, the structure, and we were the structure. I mean, the way we all had a hard time with this, yeah. Distinguishing between sort of pre-awakening agency and post-awakening agency. And so we kind of saw, even though we like to talk about this sort of enlightened agency you could have when you're driven by this force that's more than your ego. It's, yeah. It has your ego in it, but it's more than your ego. We gave lip service to how that's what we wanted. That was the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
But anytime anybody started to really express that, boom, they get squashed. Yeah. Because it was like, oh, that just looks like ego.
Yeah.
Because we were so collectivist.
So this is so interesting to me, Joel, because I wonder, This reminds me of sort of this principle that I've just been thinking about with these types of leaders, where, I know in my organization, for example, we definitely embraced the quote that the teacher comes from a place of, I give you what I can, and may you do these things and more. Right. So at some point, from the teacher's perspective, that they embrace the student rising above them. But when it comes to the practical around that, you almost never see that. And I wonder if that was going on with Andrew.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think a lot of teachers, especially Western teachers, because, in the West, especially, the kind of progressive West, and that's usually the people who are interested in this kind of stuff, we don't like authoritarianism. We don't like hierarchy. We don't like teachers. And so a lot of these teachers, they all have ideals of wanting to do that. They don't want to, and I think Andrew used to tell a story about how eventually the Sangha would become the teacher. So there's like the Buddha, the Sangha, and the Dharma, right? The triple gem in Buddhism.
And the Sangha is the community.
Yeah, he would want the Sangha should eventually become the teacher. But then he realized at some point, and he attributes this to a dialogue that he had with a friend of his, Ken Wilber, who's the philosopher. I don't know how true this is in terms of what Ken Wilber meant, but Andrew had this conversation, and he realized, he said after that conversation, that there would always have to be a teacher in order to make this thing work. There would always have to be this hierarchy that people were kind of in service of, in order for the machine to work. And so that's how it played out. And it played out exactly the way you just described it. You would have these students who, honestly, I think some of his students surpassed him.
Yeah.
At least in some ways, right. And he was very threatened by that. And, it was hard for anyone to see it because we were so in service of him. And that guru principle is so strong. You just have to let a lot go. And they're not perfect, but it's like, it doesn't matter. Like, the quirks they have are so outshone by the light that they have that it doesn't really matter, and don't get lost in the details of it.
Yeah.
So he was jealous. I mean, he didn't like it when anyone else started to get attention. He didn't like it when people would want to go off and do their own thing and not give him total credit for everything. A lot of this weird, it's funny. I know you can cut this out if you don't want to talk politics, but some Trump-like behavior.
Yeah.
This kind of never, so didn't give other people credit. And some people just, and that ultimately I think is what led to the end, right? Is that there just wasn't enough room for any of this senior group. And that included us.
Yeah.
We were the junior part of this senior group, but, and we would experience it ourselves, but then we would see people who had been involved for decades and were clearly very highly evolved beings.
Yeah.
Being infantilized.
Yes.
And not able to individuate in the way that, we all thought that we eventually one day would.
Right.
It started to create some skepticism about the program.
Yes.
But it took a long time for that to become clear in a way that it led to action.
Well, and you tend to have to be in the upper echelons of the rungs of the ladder in order to even see that, right? Because typically leaders won't shame their higher ups unless it's just within that small group.
Yeah, and they don't want anyone else to know. And that's what was happening. I mean, there was a confrontation between Andrew was trying to get, how it would work is if someone started to kind of go off, he could get other people to sort of turn on that person, right? That's just classic power dynamics. Now, again, I say all this lightly because he wasn't a dictator or an authoritarian. You know what I mean? He was an honest soul who I think got in over his head, and the dynamics took over, I think. But there was this sort of, if you keep everyone divided, they can never overthrow you.
Right.
And part of that was, he was battling collective ego. So he didn't want the collective ego to unite against him.
Yeah.
And there were some times, I think, probably when that might have been true. But at the end, it wasn't that. It was, there were people starting to be like, hey, you are not respecting us.
Yeah.
You're not supporting us. You're holding us down. And we want to be able to go off and in total honor of you and your teachings and in service of your mission, have our own expression of this. And he wasn't able to do that. And so there started to be this kind of confrontation that was kept secret from everyone else. And so I was part of this inner sanctum, right? But there was the senior half of the inner sanctum, and I was the junior half of the inner sanctum.
Yeah.
And none of us had any access to it. None of us had any idea of it was going on, because they were afraid that if they found that out, then the whole thing, if we found out, I don't know if anyone was conscious of this, but I think there was at least a subconscious fear that if word got out, then things could fall apart, because it's a very delicate balance.
Oh yeah.
And so what eventually happened is a group of students did not fall apart. In fact, they banded together and they confronted Andrew, and he wouldn't flip. But they didn't break apart the way they had every time throughout the history of the community.
This is fascinating to me. Yeah. I mean, I have goosebumps as you talk about this, because I think that is a big outlier question that you rarely see manifest in these types of groups with a leader like this, where the senior leadership decides to band together and they don't allow that schism to come in to break them apart. And there's a united mindset that then had this result that it had of Andrew having to step down, which you, again, rarely see in these types of communities.
Right.
It's very interesting.
It's so hard to do it. But the amazing thing is, then as soon as it became evident that was the case, that this group had not broken, all of a sudden, all the little things that we've been ignoring or suppressing, all the little insights and intuitions, because we're this range of adults, from like the youngest person was probably 25 all the way up to like 50,
right.
Or in some cases there were some students who were probably in their 60s.
Yeah.
And we're all intelligent, sophisticated, sensitive people.
Right.
And so we just been suppressing all this and forgetting it. And all of a sudden it was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden that started to come to the forefront, and we started to see, the emperor actually is not wearing clothes, and we're allowed to say it.
Yeah.
Now we can say it to each other. Yeah. And they can say, oh yeah, me too. And really, and you too. And all of a sudden we started to have these conversations that we had never had with each other. Cause a lot of us, some people had, but a lot of us wouldn't have these conversations amongst each other where we would share these feelings or thoughts or suspicions or skepticisms. And again, it doesn't mean that there wasn't all this light still. It was just that we weren't even able to have the conversation about the other things.
Yeah.
And when we started to, it was just done.
Yeah.
Honestly. I mean, when the thing broke, you could just feel it. You just felt it break. It's like, this is over.
Yep.
I don't know how it's going to end. I don't know how long it's going to take to get out, but I'm on my way out. And everyone was just popping.
Wow. Yeah. And so I'm also just thinking about your family during this time and kind of what happened there, and kind of this whole transition for you around your relationship with them and what was going on.
Yeah. So my family, I have wonderful, wonderful family. My parents and my sister, and just incredible people. We always had very close relationships. My parents are both United Methodist pastors.
Right. Yeah.
So, they're very liberal, very progressive. My dad's a big environmental activist. My mom, stood up for LGBTQ rights in the ministry in a very during a very challenging time. I mean, the church is actually splitting up probably over this issue. She was a big activist on this front. And so they were very liberal, very kind of world centric. Our job is to make the world a better place.
Right. And progressive, it sounds like progressive in mind, thinking outside of
very progressive. Yeah. And so, I know when you use the word Christian these days, most people don't think of that. They think of
Yeah.
the more public expressions that you see on the more conservative or right-wing side of the spectrum. But my parents were definitely not that. They're more liberal than I am.
Yeah. Interesting.
And so anyway, so we had this really wonderful, and they raised me like, they raised me to do something positive for the world. Like they didn't care if I made a bunch of money or was successful. All they cared about is if I did something to help other people. That's all they wanted me to ever do with my life.
Neat.
And so as I started to get involved in the community, it's funny. I always thought they'd be more interested because I was pursuing a spiritual life in the same way they did. So I was making my vocation spirituality. And although it was a different philosophy, I saw a lot of similarities to it.
Yes.
But they were always a little tepid, and, it took me, but I get it, because part of it was also, I was going beyond their tradition, and they're not the kind who are like really upset that I'm not a, United Methodist without United Methodist, but still, I think they probably were a little annoyed that I hadn't chosen that path. And here I was going off on some other thing. And also they saw this whole world of like spiritual enlightenment spirituality, progressive kind of mysticism as very self-serving, navel gazing, and everyone's just trying to get their own enlightenment. And what are you actually doing?
Right.
And also a lot of their, and I always remember this conversation. My dad, my whole life, has always gone out of his way to let me know that he's proud of me when I do things. He's a wonderful man. And I remember the first time in my life feeling like he wasn't proud of me.
Wow.
And it was so weird because I thought I was like fully engaged, and I thought I was I felt like I was making an impact at the level of culture, trying to deal with these deep philosophical ideas that then influence the things that happen in the world. And I was writing, which is a vocation that he taught me. He taught me how to write. And so, but then I remember him just like, I could tell both he and my mother were both disappointed in me. He said it in a very beautiful, wonderful way, that they were disappointed that I was not doing anything. Like, what are you actually doing for the world? And so we had a bit of a conflict there, but I never didn't respect my father, and I never cut off ties with my family. And we always maintained a strong relationship throughout the whole thing.
Oh, interesting. And in general, there was room for that.
Kind of. I mean, like you'd go and visit your family and you'd come back and Andrew would say things like, yeah, family is samsara.
Yeah.
Right. And it wasn't like you couldn't go visit your family, but like if you booked a week-long trip for Christmas instead of a 3-day long trip for Christmas, people would be like, dude, you're losing the plot. And you'd have to get on conference calls with people every day, like even on Christmas Day, Oh,
wow.
And there was definitely a de-emphasis, because this was our spiritual family.
Family, yeah.
But a lot of us maintained, so by strong, I mean strong relative to what it could have been.
Yes.
There was definitely a decrease in our communication and a decrease in our intimacy. But I remember many times wishing I could just pick up the phone and call my dad and ask him what to do. Like when I was struggling or when I just when I was feeling down, especially, in the later years.
Wow.
Wishing I could just call him and say, what do I do, Dad? And he would have said, leave. I'll be on a plane in an hour and I'll come get you.
Yeah.
In fact, they almost staged an intervention with me. They almost came to get me out.
And why was that?
Well, all that got sparked. So the early years, when my ex-wife, Christiana, and I split up, they heard that and they got freaked out.
I bet.
And they had started to reach out to a bunch of the people who had authored these books against the community.
Oh, interesting.
To find out, because they started to do research because they started to get really concerned about me.
I am delighted to offer you Pure Haven products. All proceeds received go right back to the Project Hope podcast. I myself have been using these pure, safe, and toxin-free products for over 4 years, and I absolutely love knowing that my home has countertops that my little niece and nephew can eat off of without worrying that they have a handful of chemicals being placed in their mouths. The cleaning products are some of my favorites. the glass and surface cleaners smell amazing as well. So if this is of interest to you, please go to purehaven.com/Jennifer French. The link is also included below with information about this podcast segment.
And they never told me any of this during the time. And they always wanted to respect my independent choice.
Yeah.
Which is very cool, I thought.
Very.
Even though they wanted to leave it up to me, and they were counseled by plenty of people, like all kinds of people they would reach out to. And I think my dad always tells me this story about one of the guys he reached out to said, look, Joel's a really smart person. He'll figure this out on his own. Yeah. Let him do it on his own. And so my dad, they kind of went along with that advice. But when my ex-wife and I split up, it really shook them. They were like, oh my God, this is the last straw.
Yeah.
Because this is just crazy. And they'd heard all these stories of people being broken up.
I was going to say, how did that even get communicated to them, and what story?
I told them
from you.
I told him, I called him up and I said, I mean, at the time it probably sounded so culty. I told him that we'd decided to take some time apart. It was like a separation. We weren't officially getting divorced or anything like that. Because, basically what was happening was, you'd be doing well or not well in the teachings. That's kind of how it was. Right. And everybody was kind of, sometimes you'd be doing well, sometimes you'd not be doing well. So my ex-wife was in an extended period of not doing well after having done well.
In the naughty category.
Yeah. And it wasn't, and by naughty, I mean, my ex-wife is like a beautiful, beautiful,
absolutely,
humble, like doesn't break rules. So like, well. Right. You probably remember, she's a way better person than I am. But she wasn't quote unquote performing. She wasn't expressing the creativity and passion of the authentic self to a certain degree. And there was a lot of nuances and details to that.
Right. And of course there are, I mean, for any listener, it's like, you can think about what's going on in your life at any given time, and you may or may be more or less receptive. And all of this can be couched in the organizations amidst the teachings.
Right.
And whether you're, on the right trajectory toward enlightenment or not. Exactly. And maybe it's even because you're standing up to something that doesn't feel right in the group that you could be boxed into you're devolving instead of evolving. Exactly. And it gets very cut and dry, black and white. And for some purposes, it kind of has to be. Yeah. Gray area is not good for the ego. Yes. Right. So if you're trying to transcend your ego, there needs to be some black and whiteness. But again, I'm not justifying anything. I'm just, but it's fascinating and good perspective again for the listeners, because for people who don't really understand these dynamics, I mean, it is just so complex. There are so many layers. Yeah. And so it was very interesting at this time, right? Because this also happened to be when I was quote unquote thriving. Of course. And I was very close to Andrew at the time. I was kind of his right-hand man in some ways, not in all ways, but in some ways. And he loved me. Yeah. I mean, he thought I was so amazing, and my ex-wife was struggling. And so we would have these quote unquote revolution retreats I don't know if they were monthly or quarterly or whatever, where we'd all get together. Overseas students would pipe in virtually, and we'd kind of it was our chance to meet with Andrew and sort of work everything out and kind of keep everybody moving forward. Right. And so I'll never forget it. I had no idea this was going to happen, but I'm sitting there and all of a sudden he's like, everybody's doing great except for two people. And then he points at my wife. Wow. And, she was the first one named. And then he kind of goes on this whole thing and, he thinks he's doing a teaching to try and get her to rise up, but it was and he said something along the lines of, he said a lot of things, she's been struggling and everyone's trying to support her, but she keeps holding back. And he's like, I spend all this time with Joel and he's amazing. And I don't even understand how he could be with someone like her, which is just horrible. And I was like, when that happened, I got the ringing in my ears and my consciousness kind of went weird and, the aching knot pit in my stomach. And I'm just going, oh my God, what am I going to do? Because
there's so many stories of this happening.
Right.
And then he hands her the microphone. It's like, what do you have to say for yourself? And understandably, it was pretty hard. She's also a very shy person to kind of say much in a moment like that. And he said, she kind of struggled with it. It was her chance to kind of rise up and prove that she was up for it.
Right.
And that's what we all learned we had to do. You had to just fake confidence in moments like that, regardless of how you felt.
Yeah.
But basically he said, I'm sorry, I have no choice, but I have to ask you to leave.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And she wasn't kicked out of the community, but what she was done is she was put on sort of probation from the core body.
Yeah.
And then, and coming back from that is just hard.
Right.
It's a very uphill climb.
Oh my gosh. And with that kind of demotion, if I can label it that, it's like, then it's so scary, I think, when you're in a couple, because that the leader's kind of stamp of approval is now off of that person. So now it says something about you.
Exactly.
If you decide to remain with that person.
Exactly. And if you're too supportive of them, you're helping harbor their ego, and you're probably sharing some kind of special collective ego between you that you're keeping secret from everyone. And it's not an evolutionary relationship, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of the day, you end up being faced with a choice. I didn't know what to do. I mean, that was the worst day of my life. I was sobbing, and my best friend, Sam, kind of broke ranks and just comforted me. And it was even worse for her, I'm sure. But it was and then it led to this bizarre period where we were still living together, we slept in the same bed, but we were barely talking. I was being told that I shouldn't really talk to her that much. I should let her just deal with it on her own to see if she can come through, which is just the worst advice ever, because your partner is the person who support you and can give you a certain kind of psychological stability that can help you deal with things like this. Otherwise, you're just going to be locked in your amygdala.
That's right. That's right. And also, I mean, aloneness as a state is already so devastating to the individual, to then be bad and alone.
Bad and alone, and no support. And here I'm the one person she's supposed to, and I totally turned my back on her. I mean, I was there. I was not mean.
Yeah.
But I was just rooting for her to pull through because I was so committed.
Yeah.
And I believed that she had a thing she had to deal with, even though I didn't really know what it was necessarily.
Oh,
but I knew and I was just rooting for her. I was like, come on, can you please just come through? Because I want us to stay together and do this together. And then, but it didn't, it was just, and so I was a total coward in that moment. I mean, in that way. I mean, and it's an understandable, and I can be forgiven, and I get that, but because the dynamics were so strong, because that was my choice. My choice was between God, if you want to be theological, and my wife.
Yep.
And I wanted both. And so I was hoping that she would come back to God so that we could have the whole thing.
Right.
And so I didn't. In a moment where I really should have broke ranks. I didn't.
Yeah.
And so and so very quickly the marriage eroded because I broke her trust, and that was my fault.
Yeah.
And
I have a very similar story, Joel, so I can
do you really?
Yeah.
It's devastating. It took me years to even scratch the surface of coming to terms with doing something like that.
Yeah.
To another person.
Yeah.
Especially to someone like that. So, I don't know. I probably will never fully come to terms with it.
Yeah.
Even though, I am in love with another woman and we have an amazing life, and I don't regret any of that.
Right.
It's a weird thing to be able to hold.
It is, but also really beautiful, I have to say, because this is life and you've had an extreme experience.
Mm-hmm.
But it also sounds like I understand the part of you that says, I don't know that I'll ever come to terms with that, because there's something about that really kind of isn't you. It's not your true nature.
Right. Yeah, I know. It's so weird.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, that rocked my parents' world when that started to happen.
Yeah. So now so did you present it to them in a way that you felt like they'd be able to understand?
I tried. I probably said some version of, she's having trouble with the teachings, which of course they are like, oh my God. Um, and, so she needs some time to kind of work some things out, and hopefully we'll be back to normal soon. That was kind of how I presented it.
Yeah.
I said, we're not getting divorced. Don't worry, but of course and that triggered them to do a whole bunch of other things,
Yeah.
including reaching out to her parents and saying, hey, have you guys heard about this? This is horrible. We need to go there and get them out.
Wow. Okay. And then how did that conversation go?
Well, it's hard to know. They basically, her parents didn't want to have anything to do with it.
Yeah.
And I think part of it was, and it's hard to know why. I've since had I've talked to all the parties involved plenty since, but it's hard to really know why. Part of it was that they were were still loosely involved from a distance.
Yeah.
And also, I think by that point, I had probably broken her trust and their trust enough that they didn't see us as a unit anymore. They were more kind of like just in it to help their daughter, and she was kind of on her way out, And so I don't know, it might have been too late in that way, but it was so hard. It's hard to know exactly why. My parents have an opinion about it, but and so and I think my parents decided not to try.
Yeah. Well,
because they were afraid that they would drive me further from them.
See, and that, like, again, as you know, I mean, this podcast is really for the families and friends that have had loved ones in these kinds of situations. And I really created this podcast for them because they kind of are the ones that we don't really speak to or talk about in terms of these effects. And just, I mean, to just put myself in your parents' shoes right now and to hear, like, I'm so glad that you've really shared kind of the fullness around your relationship with them and who they are as people, because I can imagine it's like you have an innate respect for your son and you want to maintain that. And they know that you are a highly intelligent individual and they want to respect that. So how do you make a move that you feel at its core is disrespecting your adult child? And that is, I mean, I don't know, Joel, if you've seen Seduced, which is the series that has just come out, that is India Oxenberg's story about her involvement with Nexium. And her mother is Catherine Oxenberg, who is fairly well known because she was in the show Dynasty.
Yep.
And
I've heard about,
some of this. Yes. And so what really struck me is this past week, episode 4 came out, and Catherine Oxenberg is speaking to her experience and this decision that she had to make, which she really says was like one of the most difficult decisions ever, when she couldn't get through to her daughter to go public.
Right.
I mean, how devastating, it's like you're having to reveal these things publicly that are being published in the New York Times about your daughter. And from her end, you are knowing that she is the only person in that article who didn't choose to be in it. I mean, it's really a violation in lots of ways. And yet, what other option do you have? I mean, it is kind of a black and white option. It's like either you fight for this and you go full force, or you don't and you try to kind of respect what your child's doing. Or, of course, there is an in-between gray area where you're just trying to maintain communication and so on and so forth, which it sounds like your parents actually wrote a nice line in this whole dynamic of maintaining communication with you and a real relationship while all of this was going on.
Yeah. No, I mean, I just can't even imagine how difficult a position that must have been for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know what would have happened, if they would have tried an intervention.
Yeah.
Would it have worked? I don't know.
Right.
Part of me thinks, God, I wish they would have. And then part of me is like, well, I'm glad they didn't, you
Yeah.
know?
I've had that conversation with a lot of people. In fact, so in my personal situation, my parents did try fairly hard.
Mm,
And it's interesting because once a whole chunk of us got out,
mm,
now, of course, some of these people are, my best friends.
mm-hmm.
And as we've had years and years to kind of process or discuss, or like one little thing comes up and you call someone and go, what was your perception about this?
Yeah, right.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
I have had some of my best friends say to me, I wish my parents had done what your parents did,
Mm,
and I would have felt loved and cared for.
mm,
But at the same time, some of what they did became the thing that I could hold on to maintain a distance from them, because now they had violated me. Now it was a clear black to the white.
right. Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly. Right. They play right into your game.
Yeah.
Right.
So fascinating.
It's tough.
It is. Oh my goodness. Oh, so is there anything else, Joel, that you feel like you want to share? Or
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an unformed thought, and this comes from my own reflection on this.
go for it.
I think a lot of, I think when we're thinking about these kind of fringe spiritual movements, right? I think someone did a study on these and they called them,
New
I forgot.
religious movement?
New religious movements. Maybe that's what it is. New religious movements. And you're thinking about these communities, and I guess I'm just kind of speaking to the general public now. Don't draw too quick a conclusion about what they are.
Yes.
So, and I'm in no way mean that to paper over any of the real cult dynamic, because I know they're real. I've experienced them very deeply from the inside out. I understand what all that is, but we're at an interesting moment in human history, right? I mean, there was a guy wrote an article in the New York Times maybe about 10 years ago, a guy named Russ Duthot. I think that's how you pronounce his name. He called it the cult deficit. And he said, at the most interesting periods in American history, there have been a lot of cults.
Yeah.
Cults are a sign that we're being spiritually creative. That people are kind of challenging and evolving and growing and trying new things. And he at the time was writing, this was maybe 2008, 2009, 2010, was writing about how, we're at this time where you don't have a lot of that going on, even though there always are some, including mine and yours.
Yeah. Right.
But that they're a sign of, and he thought that as a sign of kind of a banality, like a spiritual banality at a cultural level, like something was just flat and boring.
Interesting.
And that's why he called it the cult deficit. So I thought that was kind of a fascinating thing. And again, this is no way to justify anything that I did. It's just that, the religious traditions are crumbling.
Yep.
They are. They just are. That, and the ones that are the dimensions of those religious traditions that are thriving are the ones that are able to kind of modernize and be creative and evolve and change.
Yes.
And alienation, all the kind of diseases of me are all out of control right now, psychological and physical, drug addiction, alienation, families aren't as strong as they used to be. We're at a weird time. And we're finding out the truth is now under attack. The truth is now relative. Everything's relative. And people are searching for some kind of deeper meaning and purpose and some deeper sense of belonging. And they're trying to find new ways to live. And oftentimes, I think that's why people end up joining groups that become cults, or starting groups or creating groups together that become cultish, is because they're trying to experiment. With new ways of living at a cultural level and also at a spiritual level. Because I think that that's a universal human impulse. And I think it's an important human impulse that we can't overlook.
Yeah.
And I think the problem is, though, when you take these experiments, it's very difficult when you take them outside of the rules, regulations, and norms of mainstream society. All of a sudden, there's all these invisible structures that used to hold them, that they now have to take care of themselves. You have to, justice, morality, sexuality, ritual, all these things that you just take for granted, you don't even think of when you start embarking on some kind of movement that ends up in a spiritual community.
Yeah.
You don't think of the fact that, you're just looking at all the things in society that are wrong, and then you step outside of them and try to create your own. You're like, oh my God, I was being so supported by all these other things. And I think when you don't have those other things in place, those kind of deeper social mainstream kind of deep cultural structures, that's why I think you get into a lot of these messes.
Yeah.
And so when you're thinking about, and sorry, one more thing, and I'm sorry, I'm
Please.
being monologue-y.
I love it.
When you're thinking about, because we're talking about people who, this is, I guess the audience is for people who are either interested in cults or family members or loved ones. You want to have that in mind. It's not, people aren't necessarily going because they're sheep or they're broken or you did something wrong in raising them or there's something wrong with them. They're experimenting.
Yeah.
And I think, and this isn't always the case. And look, this could also be a massive justification on my part to make myself feel better, but they tend to be more bolder, more creative, more turned on, intelligent people who try these kind of things.
Yeah.
Because they're willing to risk, regardless of the kind of personal consequences. And it doesn't justify any of it. It's just a thing to keep in mind about the motive and the impulse. Otherwise, it's very hard to see it in the right light. So,
yes. And thank you so much for bringing this to light. I love that you started this thought with, like maybe a work in progress, that it's not fully formed, which actually it was beautifully stated. But I find that interesting, Joel, because it is definitely this thing that, like what you just described, is something that I am very much just swimming in a little bit right now. It's like I feel like I've got this like amorphous bubble outside of me, and I'm looking at it and I'm going, you're gray. You're not black and you're not white. And how do we really hold space for this gray area? And this is the exact, what you just said is exactly within this gray space that I want to hold and allow for these conversations and these thoughts, because this really is the exploration around why and how. And if we don't get real about that, then I don't know that we're going to find any answers. Because I really don't think you can just go, this is a cult, this is not, this, it really, there are so many nuances and so many reasons that are good. And I think, again, everybody says, I love the phrase. It's like, nobody joins a cult thinking it's a cult, right?
Yeah. Some people do. Yeah.
And there are these, there's good. Otherwise, nobody would stay.
Right.
And so it really is, it's very interesting to me what you just shared. And it also makes me think a little bit about the times changing to, if you're sort of in the spiritual new agey world, we call this the Aquarian age, right? And the Aquarian represents this sort of independence and thought and intellect and consideration of the world and the universal and the big stuff. And I do wonder sometimes if kind of the age of the guru is gone, where it's sort of like, we just don't need that anymore. So then, of course, my natural thing is, then how do we form something where there is leadership, but that it's positive, And, it's kind of like what you're talking about. How do we create a community where we can live in like-mindedness to an extent, allowing for differences, but enjoy sharing food together, sharing meals together, helping to love one another's families, raise each other's kids, all that kind of stuff. How do we do this in a healthy way? And I just have to imagine, it's like this for me is where I swim a little bit, where I don't have the answer. It's not nailed down. It's not formed completely, but I keep tuning into elements of it. And I go, this has got to be possible.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. And that's, that's a very beautiful, that's a very worthwhile inquiry.
Yeah. And that really is, it's what I want to do also with this podcast, because I really, I want to expand that understanding of just how it's really not black and white, whatever that looks like.
Yeah. I think that's a good start, right?
Yep. Right.
Push in that direction and see what happens.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Because it's it's uncharted territory.
Yeah.
I don't think there's there's no predestined answer or something that someone already knows.
Yeah. Right. Well, thank you for being on the journny with me, Joel.
Yeah. So nice, my pleasure.
Like-minded
I don't talk
people.
about this as much anymore. Yeah.
Sorry, say that again.
I was just gonna say I used to talk about this all the time, and almost 10 years on, or I guess 7 years on now, I don't talk about it as much, and it's a very wonderful thing to talk about. So
yeah. Well, thank you, Joel. I really appreciate this time with you.
You bet.
I'm so grateful to Joel for the sharing of his story. With Joel's story, I find myself appreciating how he's been able to hold the entirety of his experience, meaning the good, the bad, the in-between. And he's obviously taken ownership of his story and choices. It may not surprise you all that Joel also continued communication with Andrew Cohen after things had fallen apart. I find this a refreshing, empowering, open, and exploratory mindset. If you've heard the episodes in this podcast about my story, I share that in my experience after years of not communicating with my family, I began to question why. The message had been that I was attached and that complete detachment from them was the only path for me to progress. After not speaking with them for a long time, it was clear to me that I wasn't attached, and I began to question why I was no longer in communication. So I believe that the reason this rose to the surface for me was because subconsciously I was awakening to feeling disempowered by this. It didn't make sense to me that I could be a highly functioning person, working with people to help them sort through issues and be empowered themselves on the other side, that I was succeeding financially, that I was speaking to large groups of people, et cetera, and that somehow I was too weak to withstand communication with my parents. After all, if I believed in what I was doing, why shouldn't I be able to face any opposition or questioning by my parents or anyone? I knew the stability and strength within me, and it felt disempowering to imagine I couldn't withstand speaking to or engaging with my parents. When I left my organization, there was no way I wanted to connect with the teachers. It just wasn't something that was right for me in that fragile state as I woke up to all that had transpired. As cult survivors, we all have stories that, while similar, are different in the same way that no human is the same and will ever experience the same set of circumstances, feelings, or ways of processing. So this brings me full circle to a principle that Joel and I discussed regarding leaving room to explore and discover all the nuances, flavors of where lines are drawn on that spectrum of unhealthy relationships and groups. I think that part of this fabric of complexity is, in fact, that as humans, we are all processing these experiences and people through our own filters and tolerances. As I state, I don't have all the answers, but I do commit to exploring these nuanced complications so that we can become more clear. Thank you, Joel, for all that you've shared about your story with Andrew, with your ex-marriage, and with family, as it's all a part of this fabric that helps us to see multiple ways in which one can engage with and come out of such an organization. For the parents and family members in particular, I love that Joel's story is ultimately one in which he leaves due to the organization falling apart. And this is another way in which we could hope that your person gets out and embraces the newness that lies ahead. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Project Hope podcast. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to subscribe and comment. You can always get in touch with me at jennifer-french.com. And please let me know any specific topics of interest. And of course, I'm always interested in your stories, whether you've left an organization of high demand, high control, or if you're an individual struggling with the knowing that someone you love is in such a situation. I am here for you. Think critically, take heart, and be free.